Okay, go ahead and get set up. We'll get started in a few minutes. Get logged into Blackboard. If you still have brackets installed, go ahead and open that up. So I can remember that's something we did last week, but I'm going to go through that process again today. Since it's a hybrid class, I don't have as much time as I normally do, so usually I wait, and do some class announcements and stuff, but we kind of have to get started right away. So wait a couple more minutes in case anybody's running late, but we'll get right into it in a few minutes. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The stream's going okay. This is live, no dropped frames or anything. Perfect. Let's make sure this is set. Perfect. Okay, so a couple of things. Under assignments, I've posted your first assignment. I'll go over how to submit that today. But if you ever want to know the due dates of assignments, just click the assignment itself and it'll tell you the due date. Also, you see the number of points here. That is, so what I do is I do kind of a point-based system so that you know how much each thing contributes to the total grade. So what that means is the total number of points possible for the course is going to be 100. So what this means is that this assignment is 9 points, so it's 9% of your overall grade. So what happens if you don't turn this in? What happens to your grade? It goes down essentially almost a whole letter grade. Correct? Everyone sees that? So just keep that in mind that these assignments are very important. Because I don't do a lot of quizzes and I don't do like a participation grade and all that other stuff, I realize a lot of people in here are busy, so I try to get away from some of that extra stuff, like the discussion posts and things like that. But that means that your assignments are extremely important, and that's something I don't give on, is that you have to have these submitted on time, and your grade is going to be based off mostly these assignments, and each assignment is worth a lot, okay? These directions probably don't make a whole lot of sense just yet. We'll get to those. And then everyone was able to access the lecture, correct? Or everyone who needed to? Nobody had any issues with that? Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So last week I gave you the whole intro about, I guess very quick I need to know, is there anybody who was not here last week? So everyone was here? Okay, perfect. So I can just get right into it. So last week we basically talked about the history of the web and why the web was created and some of the things that were new and interesting at the time. And just as a very brief summary, there was a scientist named Tim Berners-Lee, and he was working at CERN in Europe. I want to say they're in Switzerland. So he's a scientist, and he deals with research papers all day, and he wanted to create a document system, what we now call a web page, to where I could hyperlink, and we don't even think twice about it today. We're just like, click that link. You know, it's we don't even think about the formality of it. To where on these documents, I could click a link on that document and immediately go to another document. Okay, and that's kind of the most important thing you have to remember with web pages. But then we also have this thing called HTML, and with HTML, that lets us actually create our web pages. Now, we have HTML creates the structure of our pages. CSS, which we'll get into later, is how we style our pages, how we make them look a certain way. The beginning of the course tends to be very boring because we don't do any styling. All we're doing is structuring information, and most people don't find that particularly interesting. If you just hang in there for a little while, we do eventually get into styling, but initially it tends to be just a bunch of text on the screen, and you put a bunch of tags there and it doesn't look any different. You're not going to be centering things or aligning things or doing any of that just yet. It's all just about structuring information. Okay, so the website we're going to use most often is W3 Schools, so I'm going to have a tab for W3 Schools open. There's also something here called Lorem Ipsum. Maybe I should actually put that more toward the top because we're actually going to use this a lot. So for those that haven't seen this before, Lorem Ipsum is just kind of like dummy text. So I'll click it just so you see what it is. You can see it's what's called Pseudolatin Text, but basically we use it as placeholder text. If you're creating a website for a business, what you don't want to do is try to fill in content for them because it might be wrong, and then they start to kind of like their eyes concentrate on that. This is just more for like it gives you something to put there for now, rather than just having to, you know, hit a bunch of keys in your keyboard. And you do want to get in the habit of putting content because there are certain things that don't become apparent until you start to have content. For example, if you only have one line, it kind of gets difficult to, so what happens at the end of the line? How does that line up? Okay. So we're going to use this a lot. Now, one of the nice things with W3 Schools is that they have a built-in, what's called the, I think they call it the Triad Editor. And with each example, they give you a little button that you can press here. And here's the HTML. Is that larger? We have the HTML, and then after we change what we want to change, we press run. And then it gives us a preview on the right. This is very convenient for small isolated examples if we're learning about a specific concept, like how to do a list or how to do a table. But in the real world, you wouldn't do your whole website like that. It just wouldn't be very practical. So what we use instead, let me just check here to make sure we're still streaming, everything's good. What we use instead is a text editor. Now there's a bunch of different text editors. Visual Studio Code, there's one called Atom. Sublime Text, I think, is another. There's probably hundreds of them, honestly, that are compatible. You need what's called a plain text editor. I don't want to really get into that. It's maybe a little bit overly technical for this class. But in this case, the one that I like to use is Brackets. It was written mostly geared toward web development. It's an Adobe product. Even though it's like open source, they still kind of, I think, have the most influence around it. And so you can search for it. Otherwise, the website is just brackets.io. What's nice is that it's essentially the same product on Mac, Windows, and if anybody in here uses Linux. There's not like huge differences between the two. It's pretty consistent across all three. So most of you probably still have this from last week, but if not, go ahead and click the download button. it should show up in your downloads. Now these computers here are restricted. I don't think they have any sort of administrative rights. So you can still run it, you just can't permanently install it. So when you click it, it probably gives you the option to grab it, to drag it over to the applications folder. That's not going to work. It's probably going to give you an error, but you should still be able to just double click the brackets icon. And if anybody needs help with that, just raise your hand. I can walk around. Normally I would demo it on the school computer, but I'm trying to stick to my laptop, not to touch, trying to reduce the number of keyboards I touch in a given day. So I'm on my Windows laptop here, so it's going to be a little bit different. And on Windows, I think most people on Windows know how to, you click the exe, you go through, there's a wizard, you can just take the defaults for everything. So while you're going through that process and setting up, make sure that you get to the point where you have brackets open. Let's very briefly talk about HTML. Okay, so I'm going to be back at the W3 Schools site here. So let me go step by step. So within Blackboard, under Resources, you should have a link for W3 Schools HTML. Click that. And then we'll just take this very first example. This one's good enough. Click Try. And then let's go ahead and write some things from scratch because I want to go over some stuff here. Now, one thing I do generally recommend is that you make any font sizes that you're working with larger. So I'll show you how to do that in brackets, but in the web browser right now, all I have to do is Control plus and minus. I think in Mac it's going to be maybe Command plus and minus. The reason being is because you're going to be using a lot of kind of characters that you don't normally use. I think most people in their given day, they probably don't use angle brackets very often, or the difference between a forward slash and a backslash. I'm guessing for most people that doesn't come up very often. But when you're doing HTML and coding in general, you tend to run into this. And when you're kind of new at something, it's just a good idea to try to make it so that you can see it as large as possible, so it's just in your face. There's no discrepancy about what that individual character is. Now, I'm not too concerned with all this stuff up here or this stuff down here. For our initial pages, this is going to be the same every single time. So let's not worry about that too much. What we're going to be concerned about is stuff between bodies. So from here to here. And let's do this. So last week, let's do this. So let's go ahead and type this. So I had what are called angle brackets. So you might call them greater than and less than signs. Make sure those are correct. And this is what's right here. This is what's called a tag. This is called the H1 tag. This means a top level heading. We'll go over headings in a second. And these tags generally occur in pairs. There's some exceptions, but in general, they almost always occur in pairs. And then this is what we call opening a tag and closing a tag. Now, just a quick note on terminology. This slash, this is very important. This is called the forward slash. The slash in the other direction, that's called backslash. Don't get those confused. You can't use those interchangeably. So we must have the correct slash. It's the key that shares the question mark. Now, once we have this typed out, we have our opening tag, and we've closed it. And notice the only, they're identical except for one character, and that's this right there. And make sure to put that in the correct spot. So some common mistakes I'll see are people put it here. Now, it shouldn't be something that you particularly have to memorize, because what can you do? There's lots of other tags here that if you ever can't remember which direction it goes or where it goes or anything like that, just look at the rest of your page. One of the most crucial skills to have when doing any sort of coding, this is like a different type of coding, this is called markup language, but still it applies, is pattern recognition. Because even if you didn't know any HTML at all, if you scanned from top to bottom of this page, you'd notice that one character is off. And knowing nothing about HTML, if you had good pattern recognition skills, you could spot that there's something off here. So get very good at pattern recognition skills. So this is called a heading. We've opened it and closed it. Now, what does a heading mean? Well, we actually have 5 headings. Most tags actually aren't like this. This one's unique. I actually don't normally, well, last week I opened with paragraph. This one tends to throw people off a little bit because most tags actually aren't like this. So let's come back to that. Then let's throw in a paragraph. So the way I generally type these out is that I open them, I close them, and then I go back and then I put the stuff in the middle. So let's go over to Lorem Ipsum. Remember I said there's under resources, there's a link, Lorem Ipsum. I click the Generate Lorem Ipsum button. And we don't need the whole paragraph. In practice, you're kind of supposed to use the whole paragraph. But because our fonts are so large, I'm just going to grab a few sentences. And again, we've opened the paragraph and closed the paragraph. If we wanted to add another paragraph, well, I don't want to do too much in this Triad Editor. But you get the idea of how it works. A couple of other things to note. Even though you technically can capitalize things, so for example, if I wanted to create an H1 here, I could do this. Oops. And this used to be the style about 20 years ago, but very few people do this anymore. Okay, so just as a blanket rule, make sure that everything is lowercase, including our file names, which we'll get into later. So notice that this was a lowercase h1, lowercase p for paragraph. So one thing I do want to note is that this is what's called white space independent. So what's white space? I don't know where the name comes from. It's just kind of like a historical term. It's just anything you can't see. So the space bar, the enter key, the tab key, this is all called white space. So what does that mean? It means that if I decide that this code is a little bit difficult to read, and I want to format it like this, because it's white space independent, it means that the enter key really it doesn't mean anything. And so if I click run, it's going to look the exact same. And there'll be instances where sometimes you want to format it like this, sometimes you want to format it like this. But note that because it's white space independent, it doesn't actually matter. If you really wanted to, so don't do this because I'm going to change it back, you can actually start to break things up within the paragraph. This is generally not a great idea. But notice that it all stayed on the same line. That also means that if you want to break something up, like put new lines within the paragraph, you can't really do that just by hitting the enter key anyway. There's other ways to do it. We'll get into the theory of that a little bit later. It's actually a little bit more complicated than you realize, when and how you'd want to do that. But the other thing to note is that you only get one space. So notice that if I hit the space bar a bunch of times here, you'd think that, okay, over here when I click run, there's going to be a bunch of spaces in between. But no matter how many spaces, even if I hit the enter key a bunch of times, it's always going to compress down to one single space. So no matter what, I've got like 5 or 6 spaces here. It's always going to be one single space. Now if you obviously just put it all together, it doesn't know that you want a space anymore. Okay, so just some details. So I bought myself enough time. Does everybody have brackets up and running and installed? Does anybody need some additional help? Okay, so let's do this. So we've run through an example, and this is going to be the basic flow of the course, is that we'll learn some things in W3 schools, and then what we'll do is we'll open up brackets. So let me open up. And then we'll take the example that we just did in class, and then we might expand on it a little bit. Don't worry about this. This is from another class. Now, to stay organized, the thing I went over last week is that what we should do is, for each class, we should, within an CGS1821 folder, we should have a folder. So let's go ahead and, if you don't already have a CGS1821 folder, create one. Probably the best spot is maybe in your documents. I'm going to just stick to my desktop. The other thing that I would suggest, if you have a flash drive, don't try to work directly off your drive. The reason being is because if you're in the middle of something and you accidentally knock it out of your computer, it's going to cause some problems. So what I typically tell people to do is do your whole classwork on the computer, and then at the end of class, copy it over. Does that make sense to everyone? So once you're done, take the whole folder that you created for today and then move it over to your flash drive. It's a little bit risky because I've seen people in the middle of their work start to lose things because maybe their flash drive is dying, or they accidentally bumped it and it's not working correctly. So I'm going to create a folder for today. So today is the 1st. And then now within brackets, what we want to do is you should have a button that's similar to this. Mine says, because I taught a class this morning, yours might say getting started. It might point to another folder, but it should be in this general location where you hover over it and it's a button. And then click open folder. So I'll do that one more time. So in brackets in the upper left hand corner, I don't know if this is nice. I wonder if this works the same. Yeah, let's try this. Just out of curiosity, I've never tried this technique. If we go to File, Open Folder, I might actually start doing this because it's a little bit more clear. Go ahead and find CGS1821, and then today's date. Now, anytime, and then open. Now, anytime we create a new file, it goes in the correct spot. The reason I'm so particular about everybody doing this is because I've been teaching this course for many years, and one of the most common problems I actually see is people losing track of their files. They'll start an example on their flash drive, and then they'll do another example on their desktop, and then they'll put another one in their documents, and then by the end of class, they've got their classwork and examples in all kinds of different places, but this forces you to put it in the correct spot. So that's why I make such a huge deal about having this correctly structured. So let's go to File, New, and this just gives us a blank file to start with. We haven't saved it. It doesn't even know that it's an HTML file yet. Let's go back over to the Triad Editor. Now what you could do is you could click and highlight this whole thing. The reason I don't like to do that is because it's very easy to accidentally leave off a few characters. With not just HTML coding, with all coding, if you do something like this, if you just leave off a few characters, it's no longer valid code. It needs the entire code example. So what I like to do in Windows, it's Control-A. I'm guessing in Mac, it's Command-A. And what you do is click anywhere in here. Let me know did that work on Mac, Command-A?
Yeah.
Okay. And then notice that you can't mess that up. It highlighted the entire thing correctly. And then in Windows, Control-C, in Mac, Command-C. To copy, and then to paste, it's going to be Control or Command-V as in Victor. So we've got a bunch of code here, but notice that it's not giving us that syntax highlighting, which we saw last week, and we see it somewhat in W3 Schools. And the reason it's doing that is because it doesn't know it's an HTML file yet. So what we have to do is go to File, Save. Now you'll notice sometimes I don't actually go to File, Save. I'll use the shortcut, which is Control or Command S for save. But in this case, I actually went to File, Save. And then we have to give it the proper file name. What I like to do is one example after another. So in this case, we're going to call it ex1.html. Now this .html is very important because that's the only way it knows that it's an HTML file. I don't want to get into file extensions. Normally I talk about them a little bit. But it's basically, it tells the operating system what type of file it is. But it's up to you to name the file correctly. Now normally if you're working like in Microsoft Word and most Adobe products, it knows what file type you're working with, right? If you're in Microsoft Word, you're working with a Word document. Because these text editors can work with all kinds of files, that one doesn't have a good drop down, but it can potentially work with hundreds or maybe even thousands of different file types. So you have to tell it the type of file because plain text is very, very generic. It's just any text data. So in this case, we have to say ex1.html. We have to let it know it's an HTML file. And then, as I mentioned before, it automatically puts it in the correct spot. So it's really hard to mess up unless you start changing folders and trying to put stuff in other places. But which, by the way, don't do that. That's just a recipe for losing your work. Yes?
On my brackets, it doesn't like have the place where it says file and
So if you're on Mac, the way to do it is actually kind of the same thing. It's actually always, so whatever program you have focus, yeah. So if you had to put the browser, it would have gone from brackets to the browser, but between brackets it's put. Yeah, so you go to File, New, take that code from over, and I'll and then I do File, and then Save. Put in the correct spot, it's going to be ex1.html. Okay, you have the same problem. And you all set and everything? Okay, so did you do the example that we did in so which open up the W3 Schools browser that you have open? So did you do the example of W3 Schools that we did? Just because we're kind of limited on time, I didn't get through a couple of examples. What I do is, if you kind of fell behind, just kind of watch up there as much as you can, and then since the lectures are recorded, you can go through it and pause it and use it. But still follow up here and watch what I'm doing so you can kind of get a sense. Normally I would be able to slow down a little bit more, but we only have another 45 minutes, and I have like 3 more examples to get through. Okay, so we've got our H1 with IRSC, our paragraph here. Just as a quick note, like I said, I don't want to get too much into file extensions, but for most people, what you'll actually see is this. You'll just see EX1. Now, Windows and Mac are a little bit different, but they both tend to do what's called file extension hiding. So I'll give you the very, very quick background is that back in the 90s and 80s, if you've got a bunch of different files and you try to click that file, what happens is the operating system has no idea what type of file it is. It doesn't know if it's a web page or a Word document or a music file. So what they'd invented were these things called file extensions. And so what you did is you did the file name, dot, and then the file extension. And then it kept a little database inside the operating system of, okay, if it's a .mp3, I'm going to open it up with the music player. If it's .pdf, I'm going to open it up with a PDF viewer. So it knows what type of file it is. what would happen is a lot of people would go in and change the file extension. And when you do that, you essentially break the file because the operating system doesn't know what type of file it is anymore. So somewhere around Windows XP in the early 2000s, they just said enough of this. What we're going to do is we're going to hide all these file extensions by default. And so that's why you tend to see things like this, ex1, instead of ex1.html, because it's hidden. In Windows, I have under View, there's an option to show the file extensions, but by default it's hidden. I tend to show it because, I know enough not to change these, but by default they try to make it user-friendly so people don't accidentally change these. Now, one mistake that I tend to see a lot is that people will do this. They'll create their file in brackets and they'll give it the correct name, and then they'll say, oh, that's weird, it's just ex1. Let me go ahead and rename it to ex1.html. Well, what you've done is you've broken it because it's not ex1.html. You've actually called the file ex1.html.html. So be very careful with that. So I'm just going to rename this back to ex1. And I can put a video or a link or something like that if that's confusing at all. For the most part, as long as you stay in brackets and you don't start renaming things, you should be in okay shape. So when we said file save and we called it ex1.html, that's what we have. Okay, so we have this ex1.html file. Now to actually view it, you'll notice up here that there's a live preview button. So we click this, and then we can actually see our web page that we just created. Okay, so let's talk about some of these different tags. So we already explored H1. To give you a good sense of what H1 is, it stands for heading. I think I gave this example last week. The site that uses headings the most is going to be Wikipedia. Okay, and the nice thing about Wikipedia is actually it's very smart, and it actually takes all these headings and it puts it into a table of contents. Usually you don't get this. This is actually some software that they wrote additionally. But it works very well for highly structured documents. Like if you're working in a Microsoft Word document and you're writing like a technical document or something like that. But you can see here that they've organized the information. So this would be like an H1 or H2 depending. And then this might be an H3, H3, H3. Let's say, for example, this is an H1 top level heading. This would be H2, 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 H2. These would be H3s. This would be another H2. Okay, so we have these H1 through 5. So H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. That's the only one with numbers, by the way. So this is what always throws people off. It's one of the first tags that you tend to learn, but there's no other tags like that. It's because a lot of this stuff was created in 1989, 1990, when Tim Berners-Lee didn't really know what the web was going to evolve into. Highly structured information like this, it's actually super common in scientific research papers. That's probably why he created it. But outside of that, most websites, it's not that common, actually. Okay, but we will often use them to like say that this is the title of my page. So let's take this and we've got our H1, our paragraph. Let's add an H2 in there. And then under an H2, we might want to put, like say this is our registration page. So the main title of the page might be like IRSC, and then H2, it's regarding registration. And then let's go ahead and add one more paragraph in here. Remember, like I said, is that I like to create the paragraph tag first and then put the content in there. So I'll create it, and then I'll go over to Lorem Ipsum. And let me use a different paragraph so it's not the exact same. Now the whole advantage of using a text editor like brackets, because we actually could just open up Notepad and just use that, is that it gives us some extra things. This is what's called an IDE. It gives us syntax highlighting. Notice that when I click here, it matches up with the other tag. The H2 matches up here, the paragraph, and so forth. Now, a very quick thing is that I like to install an extension for brackets. So if you go over here, it kind of looks like a Lego or a battery. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, but there's a button for Extension Manager. If you go over here, and under Available, so click Available, there's one called Beautify. B-E-A-U. So I already have it installed, but it's this one, not PHP, but just the regular plain old Beautify, and click Install. What that should give you, and then close it, is an option under Edit. So go to Edit, and then there should be a checkbox, Beautify on Save. So go ahead and check that. And then every time you save, which you should be doing pretty often, you usually actually won't see me do it because I don't go to File Save. I just do the shortcut, which is going to be Control-S or Command-S. And every time you save it, notice how it gave me this nice indentation. We can do this because it's whitespace independent. It doesn't matter how we indent things like we talked about before. Why do we care about all this indentation and beautifying it? It's because the clearer your code is and the more structured and formatted it is, then the fewer mistakes you tend to make. Okay, if your code is just all over the place and it's difficult to read, like, so I'm going to break this. Not really break it. I'm just going to make it difficult to read. If you've got things like this, you're probably going to make more mistakes because it's kind of difficult to see where my tags open and close, what it lines up with. But with this Beautify, it automates a lot of it. There's a lot of rules. I don't want to go into the rules just yet, but this Beautify does a pretty decent job of automating that process for you to make it much, much, much easier to read. So I'd highly suggest having this Beautify extension installed. It's really going to make your life a lot easier. And then, again, to enable it, you can, every time you want to manually beautify, under Edit, you can do that. You can click that and it'll do that. I always just like to have the checkbox that every time I save it, it's going to automatically format it for me. So we've gone over a couple of tags so far. We've gone over H1, H2, and you can go all the way to H5. It's just a heading. And in your head, you can think Wikipedia. Now, if you visually see this, you can see that the H1 is going to be a little bit larger than the H2, but don't get too wrapped up in that because we can, later on, we'll learn something called CSS where we can change all of that. And by default, the paragraph is just regular text. So now, something that may not seem super obvious, but remember earlier when I hit the Enter key a bunch of times, how everything stayed on the same line? Does everyone remember that example? What do you notice about those two paragraphs? Are the two paragraphs on the same lines or different lines? So who says the same line? Show of hands. Who says different? Okay, so they are on different lines. If you want to get a new line, what you have to do is you have to put it into something called a block level tag. So make sure you know this term, block level tags. All we've gone over so far are block level tags. The idea with a block level tag is that after you're done with that tag, it jumps to a new line. So IRSC, I put that within an H1, it jumps to another line. Registration, I put within an H2, it jumped to a new line. I put this whole thing inside of a paragraph, it jumped to a new line. I put this whole thing inside of a paragraph, it jumped to a new line. To contrast that, let's look at, so the opposite of block level is going to be called an inline. So remember those terms, block level and inline. So let's do a tag right here. So within your first paragraph, just choose a word. I'm just going to choose this word right here. And I'm going to wrap it inside, and be very careful to wrap these correctly, because, let me take a step back here. Notice that I started to type strong, so there's a tag called strong. Notice as soon as I typed it, what did it do? It automatically closed it for me. A very common thing I'll see people do are things like this. What's wrong with this? I've closed it twice, right? Every time you open a tag, you have to close it, but the order matters. And so what I mean by that is I opened a paragraph and I close a paragraph. I open a strong and I close a strong. I'm closing a strong, but it doesn't match to any opening strong. So you have to be very careful of that, okay? So, but in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this word, I'm going to put it in here. So up to this point, every time we wrapped something in a tag, because they were all block level, it gave a new line afterwards. It was basically like we hit the enter key. But what I'm telling you now is that we're going to explore something else. These are called inline. And my argument is, I'm telling you that these inline are the opposite. They are meant to be inline. They don't give you a new line at the end. It's not like you hit the enter key. So what do you notice about that second word? Is it on the same line, or did it generate a new line? So we're worried about this right here, this word right here. So first of all, visually, what do you see? What did it do to it? It bolded it, correct? It would be kind of frustrating if every single one of these tags gave you a new line, because imagine if it did lorem ipsum and then it dropped to a new line. So certain tags we have are what are called inline, and the idea is that you just want to use them inline. We want to get the effect. We want to say that this is a strong word, but we don't want to actually drop it to a new line. So keep that in mind. So the two that we're going to deal with the most are going to be strong, and on this one we'll wrap it in EM, which is short for emphasis. So I'll pause just for a second here, just make sure everyone's caught up on typing. So while you're doing that and you're typing, just a quick note that you'll probably see is that some of these tags have names like H1 for heading 1 and P for paragraph, but then other tags are the full word, like strong. Why is that? Well, when the web was first created, the general practice was to try to keep names as short as possible, because if you're dealing with, I mean, at that point they didn't even have 56K modems, even slower dial-up modems like 9600. If you're dealing with extremely, extremely slow modems, and hard drives are measured in megabytes instead of terabytes, the few extra characters you save by putting P instead of paragraph matter. Fast forward to 2020, it doesn't really matter anymore. So what you'll notice is that over the years, HTML has actually iterated a bunch of times. The standard we're on now is called HTML5. They tend not to remove things. There are a couple exceptions where they have removed things. In general, they just add things. So paragraph and H1 have been there all the way back to 1990, all the way back from the beginning. However, strong is a little bit newer. And so that's why they didn't just put S or ST for strong or something like that. They actually used the full word strong. It's because now modern practice is that it's better to be clear about things, because bandwidth and hard drive space are essentially free. Like those few extra characters aren't going to hurt anything. But back then it was actually, something you had to keep in mind. But now, for the most part, we don't. So if you tend to see, if you're confused why sometimes we use the full word and sometimes we don't, it just happens to be whatever year they decided to create that tag, invent that tag, or whatever the terminology would be. If it's older, it tends to be very short. If it's newer, it tends to be like this. Okay, so a few concepts here. So you've got the basics, H1 through H5. Remember, best practice is we just keep these all lowercase. We've got some paragraphs. And notice that we're not saying how any of this looks. We're describing it. We're saying that this is a heading. This is a paragraph. This information is strong. Now, by default, these things do have some default styling associated with them, but at any point we can override that. We'll learn that later. So don't get too caught up in how things look. And as a quick note, just keep in mind that something I've seen, I usually see 3 or 4 people do this every year. It's not P1, P2, P3, P4. H1 through H5 are very special. It just means that, again, think back to our Wikipedia example, that this might be an H1, H2, H2, H2. It's kind of how deeply nested it is. H3, this goes back to an H2, and so on. Okay, but paragraphs are independent. I could have 30 different paragraphs. A paragraph is just a paragraph. There's no such thing as a P1, P2, P3. Just be aware of that, because I do see a few people do that every year. Okay, any questions so far? Because we're going to step it up just a little bit, and the next example is going to be a little bit more involved. Let me just do the 30-second summary, because I just want to make sure everyone's good on this. Remember, these are always in pairs. Be careful that when you close, you don't accidentally double close. Just be aware that brackets and many other editors will automatically close these sometimes. You have to, the order in which you open and close these are important. So notice I open a paragraph here. I open up a strong here. I can't close the paragraph until I've closed the strong. Does that make sense to everybody? So I'll say that one more time. That's an important point. I've opened the paragraph here. I've opened the strong. I can't just close the paragraph in the middle here. The order that you open and close matters, and it's pretty intuitive. So here I opened up body. Here I opened up H1, and I immediately closed it. H2, same thing. Paragraph, I put something in the middle, and then I have to close that thing in the middle until, and then notice that once we get all the way to the end to body, everything else is closed. Same thing with HTML. We'll get into what those other things mean later, but just note that they're just tags. It doesn't matter what they are, but they're just tags. And we talked about block level versus inline. So block level, does that give you a new line? Is that like hitting the enter key? Yes or no? Block level. Yes, correct. Block level is going to be like hitting the enter key. Inline, and here's a couple examples of inline. Are those going to give you a new line? Yes or no? No. So make sure you know the difference. Now, for the most part, the tags that you actually tend to deal with most generally are block. There's very few inline tags. So let's hop back over to W3 Schools. And if you made your fonts larger, you might need to shrink them a little bit because it gets rid of the navigation once your fonts are too large. This is on your own time, by the way. This might be something good to go through. Just the first few of these talks about editors, some of the other things that I talked about. So now I want to get a little bit more complex. So sorry, I should note where I went. Just close extra stuff here. So under resources, you'll see something called article. So go ahead and click that. I'll let everyone get a chance to go there. So the idea with HTML, and this is a technical term, I'm not going to say it too much, But what we're doing is we have what's called semantic information. We're trying to describe what the text is. We said it is a paragraph. It is a heading, not how it looks. If we were to say that it's blue or red, we're saying how it looks. But this, with a paragraph and a heading, we're saying what it is. We're kind of saying what its purpose is, not how it looks, but its purpose is that it's a paragraph, if that makes sense. Now, article is another one of these, and article is kind of interesting. So the way article works is that we tend not to actually use article on its own. We tend to put things inside of an article. So in your head, you can think, okay, like a newspaper article. What do I have with a newspaper article? Most of the time, I tend to have a title and some paragraphs, some sort of content. And that's what they have here. So if we go to try it yourself, you can see here. So the H1, that's kind of like the title of the entire page. And it's basically saying that it's the article element. And then we have an article. The title of that specific article, so in this case, the title of the article is Google Chrome. Now, in this case, we only have one paragraph, but think in your head a newspaper article. Most newspaper articles tend to have multiple paragraphs, correct? And then once we're done with that article, a single page on a newspaper could have multiple articles. So same thing here. Once we go to the next article, we just open and close it, and then we go on to another article. So let's go ahead and take this. Remember the keyboard shortcut. So either Control-A or Command-A. Make sure first that you've clicked over here. Do Control-A, highlight it, and then Control-C or Command-C. And then we're going to go to File, New. And then paste it in with, again, Command or Control V as in Victor. So again, just to go through that whole process very quickly again, is that in Blackboard, under Resources, I went to Article Tag. It's the fourth one down. So Resources, Article Tag. They have an example here, but it's only a partial example. To get the whole thing, we have to click Try It Yourself. Then I did Control-A, Control-C to copy. Then inside of brackets, I went to File, New to get a new blank page, and then I pasted it in. And that's where we should be at right now. Is everyone good? Okay. Now we're only part of the way there, because notice the difference between these two pages is that one is all set up, looks like an HTML page. It's got our syntax highlighting. It's got all that stuff. But here we don't have that. So we want to go to File, Save, or just Control-S. And then notice that it put it in the correct spot. It should have put it in your CGS1821 folder with today's date. And then it's going to be ex2.html. So if you want to view this, you just click this little lightning bolt, and it starts up a little web server. Opens up the browser for you. Now, one thing you will have to kind of deal with is that it's more than just viewing the regular page, because you'll notice that if you click, some stuff happens. That's not how your final web page will be. It actually has some extra things built in called debugging. I don't want to get into it right now, but if you really wanted to view the final web page, all you have to do is find it on your computer and then open it up in a regular browser, not in like the in the special brackets version. And then as I click around here, notice nothing's happening except for the regular page. But this built-in thing is pretty convenient, so we tend to use this in class. So you can see the general structure for this is going to be, it's going to be an article, and then either an H1 or H2, and then a paragraph. Now, let's do this just as an exercise. I previously mentioned that these tend to have multiple paragraphs. So that you can see that fact is, let's go in this first article, have a second paragraph, and let's just paste in Lorem Ipsum. So let's, because like I said, in most cases you're going to have multiple paragraphs for an article. So let's just grab a few sentences, paste it in, and then remember, if you have that Beautify plugin, as soon as I save, it's going to format it nicely. And the other thing I like to do is put some extra space in here. Let's go ahead and talk about this a little bit more, because one of the things that you might notice is that we've taken this. So previously, we had our H1, H2 paragraphs and all that stuff. We had it right directly inside of body. But now notice that we're wrapping the whole thing inside of article. And it looks like sometimes H1s and H2s are outside. So it's not uncommon to have to put tags inside of tags. And it's usually pretty obvious when you can do it and when it doesn't make sense. So we've actually already seen this inside of example 1, is that when we had an inline, remember there's block level, and then there's inline. So this strong and EM for emphasis, this made sense to put it inside of a paragraph. So this made logical sense. An article, it makes sense for an article to have a title and to have paragraphs. That makes sense, so we can put things inside of an article. And it's kind of loose about what you can do. You can actually put most things inside of tags. Now, there are other cases where it might not make any sense. So I'll give you an example. Paragraphs within paragraphs, if you had to describe that to somebody, it doesn't really make logical sense, correct? So that's actually one of the exceptions when we can't do that. Notice that when I try to put this paragraph, so if I took this paragraph and I tried to put a paragraph within it, what do you notice about the syntax highlighting? What color is it all of a sudden? Red. And red is like your universal, there's something wrong here, there's some sort of error going on. Doesn't matter what text editor you're in, they tend to reserve red for things that are bad. So just keep that in mind. You generally can't put paragraphs within paragraphs, but article's pretty loose. There's another one called div. Div is very generic. Okay, so we can do that with div. And I'm just going to hop over to the assignment real quick. I just want to make sure I talk about all the requirements. So the basic flow of the class is that we do these examples, and then you're going to have an assignment that's sort of based off those examples, and I just want to make sure I've covered everything. And let me do this. I'm just going to slightly change the assignment so it's a little bit more in line with the class example that we had from W3 Schools. So in here I say to use an H1, the example that we just did. Notice how they used an H2, so I'll just to stay consistent, I'm just going to change that. Okay, so any questions about this? By the way, these tags are generally pretty easy. They tend to, like there's a tag called header. I think most people in here know what a header is. There's another tag called footer. There's one called main. That's where you tend to put all your main content. I've added a list in here. There's only a small number of them that have to be used in a very special way. For example, table. We do a whole lecture on table because it has to be structured a certain way. Lists have to be structured a certain way. But most of these, it's pretty open on how you can use them. You'll notice in here I just have a listing of, this is just a whole big listing from W3 Schools of all the different tags. So for example, and you can obviously see there's way too many here to go over. So what I usually do in class is I go over about 10 to 15, and then from there that is kind of a good launching point for you to start going through these. So let's go to, here's good. Okay, styles and semantics. So like I said, header makes pretty much good sense. Like footer, let's go ahead and, so let's explore some of these. Let's go to footer, and it describes the footer of a document or section. When might you want to use footer? Well, here's a good example of footer. So all the way at the bottom, once we're done with all of our articles, we might want to do something like this. So within footer, we usually put a paragraph, and that paragraph might just say something simple like copyright 2020. We're just saying that this is going to be the footer of the page. So hopefully you can see these are generally pretty self-explanatory. I was able to, there's just way too many to go over all of them in class, but it's over time you get used to them. So like I said, I just cover maybe a dozen or so, a little more than that, and okay. So now let's go over to your assignment. So your assignment's based off of this example that we just did. Here, example 2. And I'll go through and read it. So what you're going to do is create a file called index.html. So what I would suggest for most people is, you know how we're normally doing our daily assignments or our daily class examples? What I usually suggest is within that folder, make something called, like, I don't know, assignment 1, something like that. By the way, again, just do everything lowercase, including your file names. So the tag names are lowercase, and we also want to do our file names lowercase. Use the skeleton code that we've done previously as a starting point. So you can just go to W3 Schools and get a base page going. And then make an H1, an H2, and an H3. Sort of like we did with example 1, we did an H1 and H2. So in this case, you'd want to do an H1, H2, and also an H3. And then within that, you can be very generic. You can just say, this is heading 1, this is heading 2, this is heading 3. This first assignment is just kind of to show me that you are able to get some HTML up and running. Then what you want to do is create an article with, sorry, I've got to edit that in a couple spots. So then you're going to create an article with an H2, like we did here. In example 2. So we've got an article with an H2, and then you want to have a couple of paragraphs within that. And then for the paragraphs, just use Lorem Ipsum text. And then for the article title, just say my article. That's fine. You can give it a real name if you want, but my article is just fine. So there's going to be, so make sure you understand the structure. There's going to be one article with 2 paragraphs inside, and the heading is going to be inside as well. If that's confusing, just think back to this example. We had many articles, but in this, let's look at this one in isolation. We had one single article, and then it's got like an article title, which was the heading, and then it had 2 paragraphs. You're going to do this a similar thing. Now, it might be tempting to copy and paste this. I would highly suggest against that. Try to type them from scratch so you get some good. Obviously, I wouldn't know the difference, but you're not going to really learn anything just by copying and pasting. I realize they're very similar, but I would suggest maybe, and I'll leave the example up there so you can, going through and typing it and starting it from scratch. And then finally, research a new tag that we haven't gone over in class. So for example, one that a lot of people use is quote. But go to this page, and it just has a listing of a bunch of them, and find one. Like I said before, a lot of people will use quote. That one's pretty decent. What else might be interesting? So we did footer. Maybe header might be interesting. Yeah, so here's one that a lot of people use as block quote. There's one for time. There's one for addresses. So you get the idea. Just go through, do a little bit of research. The reason I have you do that portion of it, by the way, is because for the most part, there's just way too many to cover in class. So you're going to have to get good at going through these and deciding, okay, what's most appropriate for the type of thing I'm working with. Okay, and then once you're done, make sure it's saved. And then what you'll do is you'll upload that file. So you go over here to attach files, browse my computer. You go over to desktop, CGS1821, assignment 1, and then you'll find that file that you made, and then you'll click open and you'll upload that. So let's do this. I did want to start another thing, but I think for this first assignment, what might be best is just to let everyone have a few minutes. So even though we have 10 minutes left, I know it might be tempting to just get up and walk. I would say for most people, you can actually at least get started on it. So go ahead and do that. So let's take the last 10 minutes of class, go ahead and get started on it, and then that way if anybody has any issues, I can go around individually and help anybody. Okay, so any questions? Okay, so I'm going to stop streaming. Don't forget that if you got lost at any point in this, you can always go back to the stream and rewatch it. It's posted under lectures, and I'll make sure to have it available later today.